Right, welcome everybody. Welcome to this meeting and data centers, a new climate threat. If everyone could try and keep themselves on mute in the meeting, that will help because we've got a good number of participants today, and we're really, really glad it's Campaigning Against Climate Change to be hosting this and to have three excellent speakers to join us today because this is an issue which there has just been so much concern about, and we're hearing about from so many angles from our trades union group, from climate campaigners, and from people thinking about the global issues of what's happening in the US with data centers and here in the UK. And we'll have lots of opportunities to discuss and ask questions later. But first of all, I'd like to invite James Meadway to talk about his perspective as an economist about the climate threat of AI.
Okay, thanks, Claire, and thanks for setting this up to the campaign against climate change. I wanted to sort of do a bit of a scene setter, I suppose, and like what's going on with AI and what are the consequences are in a sort of bigger thinking about the bigger picture for what's happening to climate change, and also perhaps touch on some of the economics of this because I think that's going to become unavoidable over this year. A lot of what we see happening just fundamentally doesn't make very much sense, like in the usual economics sense of this, that a great deal of investment is now going into data centers, which are the building blocks of artificial intelligence. These are increasingly large installations consisting of potentially thousands of racks of servers, of silicon chips whirring away, processing data and generating out the other side all the kind of familiar results we've seen from artificial intelligence, so-called, over the last few years, in particular with the launch of ChatGPT back in late 2022 and the kind of explosion of interest and investment since then. And that's flowing into these things without necessarily much evidence of a return in the usual economic sense that you think about this, of like people are actually going to make money out of these things. That's not really guaranteed at that point, but I'll come back to that. The bit that we, I think, need to get hold of to start with on this, if we're thinking about the climate implications of what's going on, is that what's happened in the last few years, and really, as I said, this is since 2022 or so that things have exploded, is this new kind of demand for electricity has appeared. Like for many, many years, if you look across the developed world in particular, you're actually looking at relatively declining, stagnant or even declining demand for electricity. Like the stuff we were using was basically getting a bit more efficient. That if you take Britain, if you take much of Europe, less so in the US, but it's happening, you'll find that developed world economies were starting to see electricity demand basically flatline or start to fall. That we were getting, the washing machines are all running in our houses. We're getting more efficient over time. So you're actually using less electricity. What's started to happen in the last few years, and not only from data centers, but data centers are a major driver at this point in time, is that demand for electricity has started to pick up. And it started to pick up because what you're doing, particularly with artificial intelligence, and I don't like the labeling of this because it kind of confuses people about what's happening, right? What you're actually doing is not really intelligent. I don't want to get into a big philosophical debate about this, but if you've used your predictive text on a mobile phone, if you imagine this done hundreds of millions of times over, so the little computer can see what's happened in the past and tell you what might happen next, and that's how predictive text works. If you imagine that ballooned, this is how you get all these kind of dramatic, almost fantastical results sometimes out of artificial intelligence. You're doing something relatively simple hundreds of millions of times over, and actually many more times than that. If you take something like an NVIDIA Tensor H100 GPU chip. This is the building blocks of how you're going to build a data center that can do artificial intelligence, the large language models, the chat GPTs, the creating videos, whatever it might be. Those building block chips would do probably about 3,000 trillion mathematical calculations every second. So it's a very, very large number of calculations, but the basic point here is that these are actually quite simple calculations. You just do lots and lots of them very, very quickly, and this is how you get the big result out the other end. Now, I talk about the kind of the actual process there, because the bit to get in your head is that, okay, if you're running a computer and it's doing loads and loads of calculations, if you've got a laptop, you know how hot it gets. And if you imagine like tens of thousands of these chips all doing this, this is going to be an awful lot of heat, an awful lot of energy. And more than this, it's going to be a demand for energy of a particular kind. So it's going to be not just like, okay, you go to work in the office, and that means the office has a lot of demand for electricity during the day, but everyone leaves in the evening and the demand drops right off. You go home, there's some demand for electricity in the morning because you get up and make a cup of tea, you have a shower, whatever. You go out during the day, demand drops right off, and then you come back and watch television in the evening. Demand goes back up again. If you're running a data center, it's 24 hours, 7 days a week, continual. And it's a really large amount of electricity that you need because these little chips are doing trillions of calculations to process all the data that's now flowing into them. The game here really for the people producing these things, particularly right at the top end. I mean, there's kind of different sizes of data centers you can make, but the really big so-called hyperscale data centers, the sort of things that the government in Britain is pushing to build absolutely everywhere it can. This is a colossal demand for electricity of a continual kind, of a kind that's really unusual relative to everything else that we do. And that is a huge problem. This is where it really starts to turn into the environmental problem on the electricity side, because you're then saying, well, we can't have a supply of electricity that's just going up and down and we're going to regulate it. It's just a great big lump of demand that's coming in there that is going to be 24/7, and we need power that's there all the time. To put it in perspective, if you're thinking about our kind of hyperscale data center, demand for electricity alone is going to be, depending on how big it is really, but you're talking about a reasonable sized town of 30, 40,000 people. That would be the kind of equivalent demand. But because it's continual, and because, as far as the people installing these things are concerned, continual electricity, which you could supply from renewables with battery backup, is too expensive, and they want to get access to it quickly, they're rushing in to get fossil fuel energy, and they're shoving other projects out of the way to get there. So you see that, for instance, and the US is predictably somewhere ahead in this. They've gone absolutely crazy building data centers over the last few years, to the point where, it's become quite a serious political issue in various parts of the country, because the demand for electricity and water that these things are creating is pushing everything else out of the way. But what you're getting from data center operators, actively encouraged by the Trump administration, of course, is that a rush into fossil fuels is the quickest, easiest, ready to install. It's going to be there 24/7. Off you go, and that's your source of electricity. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that even if you have data center operators who are trying to do, and they all claim this with varying degrees, and perhaps Oliver can touch on some of this, varying degrees of believability, even if you have a data center operator trying to claim they're getting renewables, potentially they've got a backup generator that's diesel or gas supplied, and if they have to run that, if there's an interruption in supply, then suddenly it's a massive increase in emissions all over the place, and not just carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions. This could be actual direct air pollution. So Elon Musk's XAI data centers down in Texas have had air pollution complaints filed against them because they're running the backup generators out the back end of it. So that's the kind of the raw physics, if you like, of doing this, and why it turns into this exceptional kind of energy demand. Now, on the economic side of this, like, what is this doing and what impact is it going to have and where's it going to go? I think there's a couple of things. The first is that because this is all about scale, and because right at the top end, all the big operators are just rushing to build as big as they can, as fast as they can, in the belief that somewhere down the line, there's going to be this really transformative amount of demand for artificial intelligence for all these data centers, and that whoever gets there first claims the whole market. I mean, this is a business model that we're all familiar with from the last 15 odd years at least, of how big tech operates. You build everything as rapidly as possible, you push everyone else out of the way, and you claim a monopoly. That's kind of what's going on with the data center boom and artificial intelligence. Because they're all rushing to do this, you're looking at constructions that are starting to happen that are extremely unlikely to ever turn a profit. Like it's not very clear at this point in time how OpenAI, which I think is probably the most notorious and the most overextended of the various big tech companies trying to do artificial intelligence, it's relying very heavily on increasingly dubious forms of debt financing, of circular financing, of weird deals with Nvidia to supply it chips that it then promises to pay Nvidia back for over time. It's all getting very tangled over there, and its projections for investment running into the trillions of dollars imply that it has to make an absolute fortune in revenues very, very quickly, and it's just not doing that. So it's why you get OpenAI saying, "Oh, we're going to start sticking advertising into our chatbots," in addition to everything else that they're trying to rinse money out of. These things are not necessarily profitable. This has a lot of what is a classic capitalist bubble, where it's just a mad old rush to build things as quickly as possible. A load of the stuff will just fail. Companies will go bankrupt. Maybe afterwards you're left behind with some infrastructure you can use. Frankly, with a lot of these things, you're looking at data centers that it's difficult to see what you're ever going to do with the things, because you then got racks and racks of chips which are now out of date, vast expense to run the things. Who's going to make use of these great hulking warehouses out in the middle of nowhere? That's kind of the situation on the economics of the industry, and we may well find coming into this year, because it's starting to creak, that this will start to play out in various different ways. I wouldn't be surprised to see various forms of bailout happening for some of these companies. Some of the really big tech operators, Google, Meta, Microsoft, are probably going to be okay because they've just got loads of money. They can burn money on this, no problems. OpenAI, some of the smaller players, I think, are going to be overextended and will be looking for bailouts. The other part of this is just on jobs and the impact it has on the wider economy. I'll wrap up on this point because I think it's something that people always want to know about, understandably. There is an extraordinary amount of hype about AI, right, and what it's going to do to the economy, how it's going to transform everything. The truth is, right now, we're not really seeing that. MIT had an extraordinary survey of businesses in the US published a few months ago, where it did the donkey work of asking them, have you installed, large language models? Are you using AI? And then asking them whether it had made any real difference. 95% of companies report they've invested. It's not really made much impact on how their company functions at this point in time. That doesn't mean that things aren't going to change in the future, that suddenly you're going to find lots and lots of ways of working going to change, and this is going to have some impacts on employment in different ways. You can think already of how lawyers and lots of legal processes are quite rapidly getting automated. Things like automatic answering of phones, telephone call centers. You can see already it's kind of creeping into some of these applications. And then there'll be other stranger things. Software developers are getting absolutely hammered because it looks like you can get Claude and a few of the other large language models to write software really quickly and easily. So maybe that's another part of it. So you can see there's going to be some impacts down the line, potentially, around jobs. By the way, the job creation of data centers themselves is an absolute joke. I mean, the government tries to talk some of this up in terms of local jobs created. Something like Canberra's this huge data center up in the northeast, £10 billion they want to put into it. They're talking about 4,000 jobs, which is including construction, about 400 jobs when the thing's up and running for a £10 billion investment and the same amount of electricity as a town of about 40,000 people. It's not really doing very much for local economies. The broader impact of this is still a bit indeterminate. I think what we're going to end up with fairly soon is a lot of jobs are going to look different as large language models, as AI works their way into this. Some of that, I think, is going to be unpleasant in terms of what people's jobs start to look like. But the impact on employment overall is a little bit harder to spot at this point in time. Certainly, the data centers themselves really don't create jobs at all. I mean, this is just a total non-starter. They don't create local jobs. They don't create local economic growth. This is about building a hulking great warehouse full of computers that's going to make a nice fat return for its mostly US operators. It's not about what's going to happen on the ground. There's a huge environmental cost to building these things, and limited evidence that a lot of them are actually going to ever produce a profit somewhere down the line. A lot of this is pure speculative building with a big environmental cost. So that's my suitably sort of bleak overview of things. Happy to answer questions and hand over to, I think, Oliver is speaking next.
And it was Anne that I asked to speak next. Um, so introducing Anne Alexander, who is very well placed to go into some more detail about the picture of AI in the UK, which, as James has suggested, is really quite different from the sort of starry-eyed um, picture you might get from, say, Keir Starmer or others who want to convince us that this is the solution to all the UK's economic woes. Thanks, Anne.
Hmm. Thanks very much. And thank you to Campaign Against Climate Change for organising this event. Just to introduce myself, I am a researcher and I also work as a journalist where I do investigative work looking at AI. In my academic role, I work in the University of Cambridge and I've been working in critical AI for around the last 10 to 15 years. So one of the things that that does is it's given me a perspective on the growth of this industry, which predates the current bubble. Um, and I very much agree with the points that James made about the hype, about the kind of misplaced the boosterism around it as a technology. It's a classic technology bubble, similar to the railway bubble, the late 1840s. The internet, the boom around creating around internet hardware and infrastructure, and the dot com bubble of 20 years ago. And it will end in similarly catastrophic ways, but the catastrophic impacts will be felt, by all of us much more than the people at the centre of the industry. Um, One of the points that I want to make here, though, is about the way in which the AI industry, the kind of hype machine of big tech, has become heavy industry. And again, I think James made very good points about this. It's a fairly recent phenomenon. Even if you just look in the data center sector, if you listen to, for example, the people who operate the grid in the US, there are large regional grids. I listened to a podcast by somebody who was quite senior within PJM Interconnection a few weeks ago. They were talking about the impact on on their grid, it serves about 65 million people. It's quite a large one, not that dissimilar from the size of the whole UK grid in terms of the population it serves. And they said that essentially as James pointed out, they had seen their demand fairly flat for many years and suddenly spiking in the last 2 years or so, with which has been driven almost entirely by data centers. And this is the model that the UK government wants to bring over to Britain. I've done some work looking at the data center sector in Britain, its energy requirements. So the Department for Science and Industry and Trade, DISIT, calculated in 2024 that the estimated IT power in megawatts for the current data center sector, this was, from something like, December, autumn 2024, was 1,566 megawatts. Just I think 9 of the new mega gigafactory AI, so-called AI data centers that are being planned, and some of which are in the planning system and actually being built, would add a further 2,590 megawatts of IT capacity. So you can see the scale of this enormous planned build out. And I totally agree with James's point that some of this is not going to get built. It is going to explode in classic bubble ways. But some of it will be made, and some of it will have catastrophic impacts on the communities living nearby. So one of the stories that I investigated recently, and there's a piece which we published in The Guardian before Christmas, looked at the water and power impacts, which you could model of the power consumption from the data centre near Blyth on the Northumberland coast, which is one of these that has been promoted through the government's AI growth zones scheme. Um, the the impact of just the power generation would have enormous quantities of water would be used for that. And I think one of the points I'll share the link in the chat later. But one of the points I would make about that for campaigners is that it's incredibly important to look behind the green language that is used by some of the data center operators. So in this case, the data center operator promoted its cooling systems as being water free. And it's true that there are different choices you can make when cooling a data center. Some use a lot of water directly in the cooling process, and they use water chillers. Others rely on mechanical cooling, and in this case, the data center operator is relying on a mechanical cooling option where you're trying to cool the air. But of course, that's not cost free in terms of water, because the energy in the water footprint of the grid power that is required to do that is then higher. And it's one of those areas where you can see the trade-off of a promotion of a kind of green gloss over the over the operations of the data center is designed to hide the fact that this is an incredibly energy hungry and water hungry model of industry. And I would like to say a couple of words about the construct of this idea that data centers have to be on 24/7, and that AI production of large AI models has to be done at such a scale that you need to run data centers at this enormous rate. I would argue that is also a social choice. It's one that is a product of competition between these very large companies. There is an institute in the data center industry called the Uptime Institute, which certifies data centers by how much reliability they have of keeping their servers on. But this is completely unnecessary in terms of producing models that work. In my research role, I've worked with AI models which are much smaller, that can actually be run with far less electricity, and work perfectly well if you target them to what you want them to do. These very large general purpose models are an advertising and marketing construct designed to sell us this idea about artificial general intelligence, and in order to make massive profits for the companies that are producing them. And they should be challenged because they are not fit for purpose. And all of us will end up fixing the mistakes that are made by those models. And in fact, that will be, unfortunately, the impacts in many people's jobs. I have a colleague who works as an artist who uses software for working with photos. And she was describing to me about fixing the mistakes from the AI, from the image models that are producing, sheens on particular. She wanted to sheen up a picture of a candle. Unfortunately, the AI model put a picture of a mouse in the candle. That's just an example of one of the errors that you see as a result of applying these very large general models in the way that then the rest of us are called on to fix these problems. I just want to, before I finish, I just want to highlight, though, that actually this juggernaut can be challenged quite effectively. There are quite effective community-based mobilizations taking place, not only in the US, where there's been a lot of campaigning in counties such as in Virginia, which near Data Center Alley, there are large community-based campaigns there. So effective, in fact, that the data center operators have created a map that allows data center operators to see where there isn't a community campaign, so they can put their data center there, which is a good reason for you want to organize one. But also in Scotland, and I want to pay tribute to people in Scotland from, like, for example, Action to Protect Rural Scotland, which is an environmental charity up there, who have been campaigning over the massive build out planned of AI data centres in Scotland, and just, I think, played a key role actually in Edinburgh Council's recent decision to refuse planning permission to a so-called green data centre, which had been within the urban area of Edinburgh. And I'll put some links into the chat so people can see how the questions that were raised about this language of green data centres and a challenge to the hype around the data centre, I think actually did result in an impact on the council stepping back and saying this is not something that our communities need, which I think is something that trade unionists and campaigners could take encouragement from, that these campaigns can actually work. Thanks very much.
Thanks, So the next speaker, and that goes really well into it. Because Anne was talking about community campaigns and successful campaigning, and Oliver Hayes, who's from Global Action Plan, they have been are involved in a successful legal case against a data center, as well as other campaigning work. So it'd be great to hear about that.
Thank you, Claire. I've attempted to share some slides. I don't know if you can see anything. Can you see a great big pink slide?
If I unpin you, then maybe they'll take up the whole screen, because at the moment they're only showing part of. So if I do that, does that make a difference? No, you're still side by side. I'm sure it's fine.
Should I try and do that? Does that make any difference? Is that
Full
working?
screen now.
Okay, fab. Hopefully, as I move through it, you can see. Can you now see a picture of a large data center? Yes, excellent. Okay, great. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, James and Anne, for those excellent presentations, and yeah, thank you, Claire, everybody, for setting this up. Really vital discussion, and delighted to see so many people here. I will cover a little bit of the same ground, so I'll gloss over that or skip over it relatively quickly, and then as Trail kind of get on to some of the campaigning that we've been doing. So I'm Ollie, and I'm head of campaigns at Global Action Plan. We're a climate charity based in the UK, and we've been campaigning on big tech and climate really for the last couple of years, recognizing that the fundamental business model of big tech is holding back climate action, and in fact making the situation worse, not better. And recently we've been turning our attention to data centers. So, I mean, I think you all had a very good description of what a data center is, but this is one, or at least this is a proposed one. In fact, I think it's one of the ones that's already been mentioned. This is what's proposed in the Northeast, in Blythe. Very big sheds full of thousands of processors, or hundreds of racks of processors, and with a huge amount of infrastructure around them to keep them going. As James mentioned, the electricity needs are quite mind-blowing. This quote from renowned hippies, the International Energy Agency, says that typical AI-focused data center consumes as much electricity as 100,000 households. And they go on to say that, in fact, many of those, or some of those in construction today, will consume 20 times that amount. And that's an enormous amount of electricity. And as James said, there are mid-sized towns that have 40, 50,000 households in them. So that gives you a sense of just what an insane additional demand this is. The government has got pretty scarce data on what this all means, but they have kind of outsourced some of the job of making this all work to NESO, which is the energy system operator. And this is a graph from their recent forecast, where they're looking at electricity demand for data centers under fairly different, or 4 different decarbonisation scenarios out to 2050. And the important one to look at is this top one, which is, and the numbers are kind of meaningless on their own, but 71 terawatt hours is the top number at 2050. It's also worth noting that they did this a few years ago, and their projections then were half what they are now. So I suspect that each time they do these projections, they're going to go up again. But to give you a bit of context, that is more than a quarter of the UK's entire electricity consumption last year. So just building what NESO currently think are going to be built in terms of data centers in the UK will add on an additional 26% of the current electricity generation, which speaks to James's point earlier, right? That we have this complete handbrake turn going from steadily reducing our electricity consumption to almost overnight sending it back on an upward curve. And And this clearly has implications for emissions. We did a very brief bit of work with Foxglove earlier in the year, late last year, just comparing some of the published data. So planning applications that we were looking through on local authority websites, where developers had actually given some data as to their estimated CO2 use, and a lot of them don't, shows that just 10 of the planned data centers currently in planning for the UK, and there are about 100 that we know of, probably slightly more than 100 in planning. Just 10 of them, using their own data, will effectively wipe out the savings that we're making annually from the switch to EVs. And that sort of speaks to me of the wastefulness of it. You know, decades and decades of work has gone into this kind of slow transition, speeding up now, I think, but slow transition from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, and it's being undermined almost in the blink of an eye. And this is just a tenth of the data centers we know are in planning, and the data is patchy, and we suspect it's a massive underestimate as well. Now, that's all just kind of assuming that what will power the data centers is the electricity grid, with its current mix of fuels. Clearly, some of that is renewable and growing, and some is still fossil fuels. But the kind of mad rush to get this stuff built and to capture the market, as James was explaining, has seen the tech industry be totally straightforward about the fact that if it's a choice between waiting until they get a grid connection, waiting until there is enough generation capacity, or just building gas and powering the data centers with gas, they want gas. And this is Jensen Huang, who's the boss of NVIDIA, the most the biggest, richest company in the world, saying, you know, if the UK, just laying it on the line, if the UK wants to build this stuff and it wants to be leading this revolution, then it's going to need to rely on fossil fuel generation, and that's clearly, you know, disastrous for the climate. If you're building enormous data centers with enormous electricity, enormous power demand, and you're meeting that demand with pure 100% gas generation on site, that's dreadful. I think this has already been mentioned. This is a brilliant bit of reporting covered by DSMOG, but the reporting was done by a group whose name I've now forgotten. This is the Memphis data center that powers XAI, and it shows the gas which is being emitted, and a lot of that is also unburnt methane as well. You know, the most potent short-term greenhouse gas, and as a commentator put the other day, Ketan Joshi, who's an energy analyst and commentator, you know, there is nothing about this whole chain that isn't toxic to people and the planet. You know, what we see here is clearly polluting, and then the end product is nudifying young girls. It's an astonishing thing that we are letting, well, we're not letting, but is happening because of the gold rush that James already described. The other impact, which has been touched on, is the fact that data centers, in their view, cannot afford to be offline at any point. So they have to have backup to ensure that if the grid does go down, they can keep going. So most, if not all, of large data centers will have backup diesel generation on site. And this is an example taken recently from Scotland, where the analysis was that the diesel generators, were going to generate the equivalent air pollution to 100,000 idling cars worth of diesel. And someone asked me about this recently in a similar presentation, and said, well, it's okay, it's backup though. So I mean, as long as the power grid doesn't go down, this doesn't matter. But that's not, unfortunately, how it works, because you have to be able to demonstrate that your kit is working the entire time. So there is a stringent testing regime that they go through. They fire up these generators monthly at different capacities, but sometimes it's full beans, you know, make sure they can actually run the whole thing. And again, some planning applications will detail this, and one we looked at in Bedfordshire shows that just the testing regime of the diesel generators will generate 2,000 tons of CO2 annually. That's before the data center is even doing anything. It's just testing. Clearly, electricity is not the only concern, and neither is air pollution. Water is a big problem. As Anne has already mentioned, that the industry is very keen to tell us, oh, we don't use it anymore. That's not quite so simple. Clearly, there is also a massive and unsurprising overlap between where the bulk of data centers being planned are going to be built and the most water-stressed regions of the country. And I mean, this is again a staggering lack of kind of interrogation of data centers plans for this, or in fact, their stated impact, let alone their mitigation. So it's a huge concern, and we can touch more on that if people are interested. The other thing that campaigners that I engage with, particularly in the US, are very keen to mention is that data centers and their energy use and water use are just one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is what AI is enabling in terms of further fossil fuel extraction. And the first and biggest clients of big tech's push for AI are fossil fuel companies. And this is the chart taken from the excellent Enabled Emissions campaign that shows that just 2 Microsoft projects, which are supporting Exxon and Chevron, have got 300% of the emissions of Microsoft's entire annual emissions, including its data centers. So this tech is being used to extract way more fossil fuels than were previously extractable. That is what the fossil fuel companies are throwing their money at AI and big tech to do. So it's a pretty it's a match made in hell, or depending on heaven, I suppose, if you're Exxon. Just to finish off on the kind of impacts, clearly the ecological impacts are massive and not sufficiently addressed. What we're also seeing is that other very pressing needs, such as the need to build homes and get people in them, are being impacted by these data centers. Quite well rehearsed example is that coming from West London, where 3 London boroughs had to pause house building projects because they couldn't get grid connections for their house building because the concentration of data centers in the area were sucking up the grid connections and meaning that the houses couldn't get connected. So people are not being able to move into much needed homes because data centers are being built to do what exactly? We don't really know, but it's clearly not something which is being grappled with seriously by the government. So just to come on to what some of the stuff we've been doing, where I've taken a bit more time than I meant to, but we have been looking around at some of these planning applications, and we were co-claimants in a judicial review, co-claimants with Foxglove, who are the tech accountability group, also based in the UK. And this was in a decision in Buckinghamshire where the local council rejected a data centre, not one of the biggest ones, it must be said, but still pretty massive. They rejected it twice, and then the government called in that decision and ultimately overturned it and gave the approval to the data centre. And we challenged that approval. And the reason we did that was because there was absolutely no attempt to even do an environmental impact assessment of this data center. In fact, the planners said none was needed. And without getting too far into the detail of it, the reason they did that was because they were only looking at the energy and associated emissions that were coming from the office, not the sheds full of servers. So they said, okay, right, we've got an office where, a couple of printers, some lights, bit of heating, probably a fridge or two. That's going to generate X energy need and therefore Y associated emissions. And so we'll put on a couple of solar panels on the roof. We'll power that office with a heat pump or two. Bob's your uncle. And the planners said, great, that's all fine. And they considered that the energy and associated emissions of the massive sheds full of servers was unregulated and therefore didn't need to be looked at. And we took the view that that was legally questionable and submitted a judicial review. we had what was really kind of stage one in the hearing at the beginning of the year, the end 22nd January, we were in the Royal Courts of Justice just to see whether we would get permission to take this case forward. And a few days beforehand, the government wrote to us saying that they had made a serious logical error and that they were pulling out. And that they thought the original planning permission should be quashed, the planning permission they gave. But we then had this absurd situation where the developer said, no, you were right the first time, government, you're wrong now, so we're carrying on. So we had our day in court where the people we were challenging agreed with us, but this third party didn't, and it was all very silly. Anyway, we were given permission to have the case heard, and that's coming further down the line. But I think this will be, obviously we do care about this specific data center, but we are also really looking to how can we set a precedent that these applications must be looked at for their true environmental impact and mitigations put in place. Because the other element of this case was that initially the vague and completely meaningless commitments of the industry were taken into account by the planners. So there's something called the Climate Neutral Data Center Pledge, which is just an industry initiative that means nothing. And this was taken into account in the planning documents. And the court, the government now admit that they shouldn't have done that. And this is this is a picture of a few of us gathered outside the court, and a picture of what I think is going to start to really grow, and what I hope many of you on the call will be keen to get join in with. There are representatives here from the Residents Association in Ivor in Buckinghamshire who are obviously most directly affected by this data centre, but also from campaigners in Brick Lane in East London, where social housing needs are being bulldozed in terms of in favour of a data centre, others from Havering in East London. And I think the more that these cases start to bubble up, the more that resistance will grow. As Anne said, people are already achieving big success by resisting this industry and resisting this narrative of inevitability where they live. So I think it's a very exciting moment for this movement. We've produced a map on our website, which you can stick your postcode in and see if there's a data center planned near you. It's the best we can do at the moment, which means there's definitely some missing. So if you see a gap, please let us know. There are details on our website, the Global Action Plan website, for how to do that. And finally, we are having some days of action at the end of this month, in a couple of weeks, where we're just really keen to see anyone who wants to take action against the imposition of AI data centers across the country, to do as much or as little as they want. Just taking a picture of themselves and posting it on social media would be absolutely fabulous. So my colleague Owen is organising that, and if anyone on the call would like to find out more or get involved, and we have some resources available and some ideas of how you can take action, that would be really fantastic. And I will stop there. I've used way more than my allotted time, and I apologise.
It was all really high quality content. It's fine. But now I'd like to see if people have questions for our speakers, or maybe there might be people in this meeting who are themselves involved in local or national campaigns relating to AI. So if you put your hand up, one thing I might there's probably a couple of things I might want to throw in. One is that sometimes the sort of people who are arguing that AI isn't a problem are saying that it's small. Look at all these other things. It's relatively small. It's not a big deal on a global scale. And look at all these other things that are pushing up demand for electricity. Now, for me, that it seems that the other things that are pushing up demand for electricity are mostly through electrification and reducing direct demand for fossil fuels, and AI is a big deal in terms of its impact on emissions. And the other thing I would ask about is if this our panel think it's a problem that the term artificial intelligence and how it kind of mushes everything together from very kind of specific things that might be like weather forecasts or making systems more efficient to generating AI slop videos. I can see there's some comments in the chat, and I can see someone on the phone who would like to come in. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Sorry, I've got something in my throat. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. This is Marion from Glasgow and UCU. First, that's Marion Hirsch. Could I be emailed everything that's in the chat, as I don't have access to the screen, so I don't have access to the chat. Second, yeah, I suppose a wee bit of campaigning, a wee bit of research, yeah, there's not as strong as it could be, but there's a motion coming to UCU Scotland Congress at the end of March on AI and sort of problems in the workplace. And, you know, I presume, or I may even put something through my branch, there'll be something at UCU Congress. And obviously, it's not just trade unions putting motions, though that's part of the process. It's also sort of then using the motions to actually take action and campaign. And very briefly, in terms of research, I've been looking both with a colleague in Ireland at sort of the regulation and sometimes lack of it of AI, and also sort of lack of diversity, particularly underrepresentation of disabled, neurodivergent and deaf researchers. And I have an ongoing questionnaire if anyone knows someone who might be interested. And a lot of stuff has come out of that, including the fact that motivation to get involved in it is often concern about the negative impact and sort of being in there to see what can be done, rather than being motivated by the sort of positive potential.
Thanks, Baron. You mentioned a few things there, and one of them was about how trade unions can act on this. That's probably something that we can be thinking about maybe through our own company as Climate Change Trade Union Group. And while I'd encourage everyone to post resources in the chat, you can't do that. So you could maybe email them directly to me and I could share them around. Ian's next in the queue.
Hi, I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm based in the East Midlands, as you know, and we've got two big developments that have been made known. They both occurred actually after Angela Rayner got the push and Donald Trump visited. It's kind of interesting. And the whole team, the devolution team, was all changed. So Steve Reed, Baby Bill, came in, and he think he's overseeing the devolution agenda. So I put a question to our new mayoralty, who ostensibly are overseeing data center development. I put a long question together that heightened all these terrible concerns. And what they did, they edited me out of the video stream, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? So I appear for about 10 seconds and then I just disappear. And the response also disappears. So we've got to try and deal with that. But their general response is that, AI must be good because everybody says it's good. It's economically good because, and you've got to try and knock that down. They're working on that basis that it's wonderful. And the second thing is, I asked them who was governing so it could make life difficult for the people that have got the, overall control. And they don't know. So I think with this, when Trump came and all this money was talked about, which has since been withdrawn, they've just invented so apparently if we get an AI development center grant from the government, which probably won't get, then there'll be a governance structure attached to that, which will probably won't have anything to do with the local community. So has anybody else met this kind of Kafkaesque kind of peculiar process that's going around development?
Thanks. Susanna, if you move your cat,
Is it our turn to speak? Yeah, sorry. Yes, so I just put a question in the chat. The organisation I work for is thinking of maybe having a very hard line approach against the use of AI within the organisation as a way of kind of backing up our public stance. And it's not clear whether it's going to be possible to hold that line, but we quite like the idea of maybe becoming part of a growing AI resistance movement, even though it can have, it means sort of denying yourself potentially the occasional useful thing. But I just wondered if anyone was aware of other organisations planning to do that or already doing that, and who might have already thought through what their policy would look like, and had anything to share with us on that. From Fuel Poverty Action. Thanks. If you've got an answer, you could just put it in the chat. That's going to save time.
Yes, Suzanne, I think Fuel Poverty Action have got a meeting on AI this Thursday. People want more, and there's been about Drax and some other issues. But next, I'm going to bring in Harry, who's from the Pull the Plug campaign.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for those talks. It was absolutely fantastic. My head's still spinning from all the information. It was a really, really great and interesting. I mean, I just wanted to put it to the group. I mean, what would it look like for communities to have some sort of binding control over data centers coming into their communities in the same way that they do for major or big infrastructure? What does that actually look like? How could we get some sort of policy or legislation in place that would actually allow communities to dictate whether or not that could happen? And secondly and lastly, I just wanted to mention, I know Ollie said that there is a lot of there is on the 28th of this month. People are going to be acting, they're going out into the streets, they're talking about the fact that these data centers are being built all over the country and people are actually going to be turning up outside of them. For anybody that isn't able to appear outside of a data center, we're organising a rally in central London. So it's part of a campaign called Pull the Plug. and we're saying that, you know, people should have more say in how AI is used and utilized and controlled, and that there should be citizens' assemblies effectively to decide these things. And so we're having a rally in central London. I'll put the details in the chat. If anyone's able to attend on the 28th of this month of February, it's the same day as Global Action Plan's actions against data centers. So yeah, please do come along. Thank you so much for the talks. Really, really appreciated it.
Cheers. John?
Yes, I think just to underline some of the points that have been made, I think this massive, crazy push for these hyperscale data centers is represents a massive misallocation of resources. So the electricity that's going to be powering these data centers could be used to warming people's home. You know, we have a major issue with fuel poverty in the UK, and I can see this increased demand for electricity, pushing up the price of electricity and adding to fuel poverty. Some other points is, some of the points people made about decarbonisation of the grid. Well, there is a government industry working group which publishes minutes on the government website. And last June, according to their minutes, the industry representatives were lobbying the government for more gas. And the whole reason why, we've got this situation is we're allowing big tech to dictate the pace of this transition, and we are not, as a society, having any input into the debate. Now, obviously, there are clear use cases, beneficial use cases for AI. It's not something new. We've had AI for decades, as Anne has pointed out. It's a particular form of AI with these large language models, which have enormous energy requirements for training and have, hundreds of billions of parameters. And this push for artificial general intelligence, which is problematic. And I think what we need to be, and I agree with what the campaigner is saying, that we need to be calling for a pause. And we need, as a society, to discuss what we need to use AI for, rather than allowing people like Elon Musk to dictate what is built, where is built, what it's used for. And there are similar campaigns happening in the NHS. I know Palantir isn't a hyperscale data center, but it's one of the major customers. And it's also quite a sinister organization. So I think we need to bring all these campaigns together and do something on a national scale. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Is it Tanya in the queue? Your name's now an email address.
Yeah, hi. It's Tanya Murat from Southwark Defence Council Housing and Southwark Housing and Planning Emergency, or SHAPE. I guess one of the reasons I'm here is because, although I'm very concerned about the water impact, electricity impact of data centers and the pollution and so on, the thing that really interests me as a housing campaigner is the impact it's having on the already appalling situation of housing in this country. The fact that we're in a housing emergency, and the fact that the planning system, although there's been some brilliant refusals of data centres, the planning system isn't really set up to prevent masses of data centres being built. And so you have them, being proposed in the middle of urban areas. And the one I'm particularly interested in is the one in Brick Lane, because there the housing people in the area desperately need new homes, but the data centre proposal has trumped that idea at the proposed site of the Truman Brewery. I am part of an organising effort to put on a national housing demonstration, which is going to happen in central London on the 18th of April. And I'm one of the organisers of what we hope to be quite a significant planning block on there. And I think that anyone here who feels like the planning regime needs to be put into the spotlight, we need proper regulation. We can't let developers, rule in an untrammeled way like they're currently ruling, creating environmental destruction and, actually contributing to the the housing emergency. If you feel like your campaign or you as an individual would like to be part of that, then I've put my email address here. Just contact me and I'll send you the invite to the planning block on the national housing demonstration, which is due to take place in central London on Saturday, the 18th of April. And it would be great if some of the very inspiring campaigns that are on this call could come together with us on the planning block, because I think we've got a very important thing to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to take Katie and John, who are in the chat, and then might bring speakers back in because I know James has to leave a little bit early. So, Katie?
Hiya, thanks everyone. First of all, just quickly, the Drax data centre has been mentioned, so I'm just going to share. We have got a current Biofuel Watch, a current e-action for TUMP about that, and do go to the webinar on Thursday to find out more. The Fuel Policy Action webinar. I think Ellen's posted the details in the chat. But my question, and I suppose maybe it probably does link with the judicial review, is how does all this increased energy demands that isn't, we've seen it, the government says there's a preference for low carbon energy sources, but there's nothing kind of legally binding there. How does it fit with legally binding carbon budgets? And is that where are we up to with that is my question. Thank you.
Yes, John?
Yeah, I have a question about life cycle management of all this hardware. I believe that e-waste is the fastest growing waste stream globally, and obviously all this hardware is made out of metals and rare earth elements, which are extraction, which is highly destructive, and then the disposal of it at end of life. I mean, I think all this hardware is quite short lived. So I don't know. This is a question for maybe for Anne, about, is there anything, I kind of work in this kind of industry, and what I'm looking for is any way to scrutinize or hold to account the corporations which are doing this. If you're going to be pragmatic and say that you work at a company, as I do, there's going to be an AI in it, and what can I look for that would make them any less worse?
Right, there's been so many contributions and questions, and I'd like to ask James, if you want to come in first out, speakers, and then if you need to leave, you can do that, and don't feel obliged that you need to answer every single question or respond to every comment.
Okay, thank you, Claire, and thanks for a really good discussion and questions there. I'll just pick up on two, which I think I'll probably say something about, because I mean it's just impressive hearing the sort of range of campaigns and things that are now happening. So a couple of them. One is look on the life cycle management. I think we didn't really touch on this. I think it's a huge problem. I mean, you're absolutely right. The e-waste is going through the roof anyway. Top of my head, the UK is one of the worst developed world countries for producing e-waste per capita and recycling it. I think bizarrely only Norway is ahead of us. The last time I saw any figures on this, so it's sort of it's something that we lag behind on anyway. If you then start saying, well, we're going to produce a load of data centers with thousands of racks of chips stacked up in them, and then you're going to add to this massively. And you're absolutely right. The depreciation of these things is absolutely through the roof. As Anne said, it's driven by the business model of big tech to think you have to get to the cutting edge. The cutting edge is doing this at the biggest scale you can get to as fast as you can with the newest NVIDIA chips or whatever installed, which means your chips that you're installing now are going to be completely burnt out and useless in tops about 2 years' time, right? And you have to redo the entire thing and restock it. So this is an extraordinary turnover that we're producing there, which also has this sort of climate change impact of actually just producing the chips in the first place, by the way. I mean, if you take the life cycle in this, it adds up really quite impressively. So yeah, I think this is an additional thing to chuck into what on earth we're doing all this in terms of like what you're doing at the end of life. The solution to it in practice is something Anne touched on, which is, yeah, you can use the technology, but you don't have to use the all singing, all dancing large language model that does absolutely everything. A specialized use of some part of AI, some bit of the software, something where it's a particular application. I mean, this is where we should be going with this stuff. I mean, if you're saying we could use this for drug discovery, this looks to me like a relatively sensible small scale use. We can improve weather forecasting, that sort of thing. If it's like we're going to build artificial general intelligence and that means we're going to have the biggest company on the planet, this is complete, essentially fantasy, right? That's what you got into there. The other bit is from Katie, which I've done some work with Oliver about in particular, and a few of us on this, that it's a really bizarre thing that still the government's carbon budget doesn't in fact include data centers as yet. It just falls outside of that regulation. So that when Ollie had them up earlier, the National Energy System Operator has got these projections. So what's going to happen to data center use? As far as they're concerned, it goes through the roof over the next sort of few decades. That is not currently included inside the government's carbon budget. With Ollie and the people from Foxglove, we put in a submission to the government's inquiry about this, the Environmental Audit Inquiry, Committee inquiry about this, and have raised it also with DESNET's, Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero, and basically sort of got a stonewalling answer on this. I think it's really worth pushing to try and get the thing included. So there is actually a regulatory framework that starts to get applied to some of this stuff. Of course, if you do this, it means that the government's grand schemes of data center expansion just can't happen, right? Because it's going to be outside of what the carbon budget would allow, you'd have thought, which is why they're kind of not so keen in it. But I think it's really worth pushing on because this is the obvious regulatory, national level regulatory change that we could be going for. I'm really sorry about having to zoom off. Leo will be wanting to eat his dinner and that sort of thing, so I better go with that. But thanks very much for the discussion and for the invite to speak.
Thank you. I wonder if anyone has any burning questions, then the last chance to stick your hand up. I did see one in the chat about what difference it's going to make if data centers are designated nationally significant infrastructure, which I think maybe Anne or Ollie could answer that one. And there's so much conversation in the chat. I haven't kept up with all of it, but I'm sure.
I'm very happy to come in on that one quickly, Claire. And I'm sure you will as well. Yeah, we haven't touched on it quite as much in this call, but the principal kind of policy mechanism the government are pursuing to get this stuff built is rigging the planning system in favor of data centers. So they are they've already designated data centers critical national infrastructure, which is the kind of security thing, and it affords you the same sort of security protections as power stations and such. But they're also trying to, as you mentioned from the questions, they are now in the process of allowing data centers to opt into the nationally significant infrastructure project regime. And that is effectively a way of taking it out of local planning and into national planning. And the intention of that is to streamline things and to stop pesky local campaigners or local authorities saying no to things which the government thinks they know better about. There is a really critical opportunity relating to that coming soon, which is that the government, to make that change, to enact it, the government have to publish something called the National Policy Statement, setting out essentially the criteria by which they will judge these applications. And I think it's very important that people engage in that and make as much song and dance about it as possible, and ask all of the questions that have been asked in this this webinar, starting right at the beginning of what's this all for, and also, when you say AI, what do you mean? I think you, Claire, I think you brought this up, as AI as a term, it's as meaningless as saying we like transport. It's like, well, what do you mean you like transport? Do you like cars and planes, or do you like walking and cycling and public transport? It's let's break it down. And this, that we need to not be naive about this process. The government is going to try very hard to make sure it gets through what it wants to get through, and that's going to be the nature of the consultation. But it is where they're going to have to set out the criteria by which they will assess these applications. The only other things I wanted to pick up on, well, James kind of covered your question a bit there, Katie, but yes, I would say if your question is how does it fit with legally binding carbon budgets, the answer is it doesn't. And they are avoiding any situation where they have to clarify that. But even beyond the sort of satisfying campaigner kind of gotcha moment, they have these two competing priorities, which are just going to have a head-on collision. If you're trying to rapidly decarbonize the power sector and rapidly build AI data centers, the two are on a collision course. And we are starting to see that play out in kind of ministerial briefings. The Miliband and Kendall kind of clash is starting to happen now, and that might be an opportunity for for campaigning. I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thanks. Anne, are you able to come in?
Yes. So, I mean, I think the point that's raised about the critical infrastructure and the nationally significant infrastructure projects frameworks is really, really important, because we have to understand that there is a language used about critical infrastructure that's used to hide from accountability the industry that builds data centers, the AI industry that uses the data centers and also builds the data centers, and politicians who want to build more data centers, but also who want to work with this big industry. Because one of the things is the problems about the lack of scrutiny of what happens in a data center, because when you say it's critical infrastructure, I would imagine most people think that's stuff that you really need if there is a crisis, like the hospital to keep running or the traffic systems maybe to keep running. There are potential uses of there are things that happen in data centers that may well be critical in a genuine sense, but making like watermelon crocodiles and posting nonsense is not one of the things that I think is critical, and most people would not consider that to be at the top of the list of critical things. And so some of the argument that needs to take place is, again, puncturing the hype around the AI companies, and to say that they should not get to decide what is critical. There needs to be accountability about these things. And one of the really perverse things that we've seen is that some of the fossil fuel infrastructure that's used for backup purposes, apparently for data centers, and I absolutely concur with people who pointed out that I think, Oliver, you talked about the turning on the generators in order order to make sure that they're working. They don't count as standby power unless they can be turned on at the flick of a switch. And in fact, some data center operators in planning documents that I've looked at have said that their banks of hundreds and hundreds of diesel generators are a form of climate resilience. So that if the power goes down because of the climate change that they are fueling, then it's fine because they can power up the diesel generators to keep it all going so that we can have the chatbot still running while, you know, the storm hits or whatever. And again, that's part of the taking this apart and arguing through this language about critical infrastructure and resilience, and so on. I would also, I think the mention around Palantir is very, very important because Palantir, as one of these large tech companies, which is part of makes weapon systems, which is named as a company by Amnesty International as being an accessory and a facilitator of genocide in Palestine, is also embedding itself in our public services using similar kind of hype language, which will require the gathering of more and more data and the use of more and more AI, of more and more training data to be collected and more training of AI models to be done, which creates a sort of self-perpetuating cycle. People from Palantir have been lobbying for a long time to make a bonfire of red tape in the planning processes. And that's one of the things they've been saying to people in the government. So they wanted to tear up the planning system in order to be able to enable this AI, you know, the AI infrastructure to sell their products. So again, that it does link up, and campaigns that highlight the harm that can be done and objections to the use of these AI products in, you know, for example, in public services are exceptionally important. And that's a place where I think you can make links between people who are involved in different types of campaigns. I definitely agree with the point about the e-waste and the life cycle of these products. There's been a huge acceleration of the the production process for these novel forms of semiconductors and so on. This is one of the things that's also driving geopolitical competition around access to so-called rare earths and critical minerals, which creates a feedback loop with forms of military competition that you see then across the planet. It's one of the things that's driving Trump's interest in Greenland. It will have a spillover effect in terms of wars and conflicts around securing access to some of those deposits of minerals. Is another reason why the hype around this and arguing very strongly to slow down the process of creating this technology is really important. Just the final point around the kind of general intelligence. I think it's really important to recognize that there have been lots of general companies. We've had General Motors, General Electric, and the arguments for general intelligence are of a similar nature. It's people who run very large companies who want to continue to dominate the market and to play dice with all our lives. And that's actually what's going on in this race for dominance between the large companies. And data centers is one place where it manifests. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And thank you so much to all our speakers, including Oliver and James, who has now gone. And thank you so much to everyone who's participated. This feels like only the start of the discussion, and well, for some people who have been involved in it for much longer, but we've touched on so many things, so many issues that need a deeper digging. But thank you so much to everyone today.